I'm really pleased to introduce now Dr. Amanda Gulsrud. Amanda studied under Connie, and she's also an expert in interventions. But a few years ago, Amanda took over our neurodevelopmental clinic, previously our autism clinic, now called the CAN clinic. And she will tell you a little bit about that, but mostly she'll be speaking today on current research on ASD in adulthood, what we do know and what we don't. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Amanda Gulsrud.
I need this if I have that, right? Okay, all right. So, as my mentor Connie Kazri said, the gig is up. I am an early childhood researcher giving an adult talk. But I will tell you, in my new role in the clinic, the Child and Adult Neurodevelopmental Clinic, the A of CAN has taken up a considerable amount of my time. Adults on the spectrum are in great need. They're flooding into clinics across the nation, and today I'm going to take some time to think about adults on the spectrum, a population that I think is often ignored. So I'm going to start by thinking a little bit about the historical perspective of adults on the spectrum and what we know based on timing and where we are in time right now with what we know about autism. And then I'm going to actually look at a beautiful longitudinal study that has followed adults for about 15 years and look at contextual factors related to development in adulthood. And lastly, I'm going to spend a considerable amount of time thinking about the evidence for interventions and supports for adults on the spectrum, what we know, and more importantly, what we don't know. So I imagine these are pretty popular images for you all in the media. And what I want to point out here is what I reiterated earlier, that there really is an overwhelming focus on ASD in childhood. It's often considered a childhood disorder, and it was a childhood disorder for many years, thinking about the youngest individuals affected with autism. But more recently, there's been a trend to acknowledge adults with ASD. And this is some popular media from the last few months. And I want to take a moment to read the titles to you, because I think it illustrates the job we have before us. The New York Times wrote an article called Adult, Autistic, and Ignored. The Washington Post wrote a nice online article, For Adults with Autism, a Lack of Support When They Need It Most. And The Atlantic coined the generation the missing generation. So we have a real problem on our hands. We have a group of individuals who are growing into adulthood at a rapid rate, and we need to be more prepared to deal. So from the diagnostic boom of the 1990s, you can see that our ability to diagnose has gotten greater and greater, and the prevalence has risen higher and higher. And those individuals from that beginning of that diagnostic boom are now adults. But unfortunately, that's just the tip of the iceberg. If you look historically, this is a relatively new phenomenon, right? Even Leo Kanner's first work on autistic children, those individuals would only be in their 80s right now. And even when it was first formed in the DSM, those individuals are middle-aged right now. And I think the most shocking and startling statistic here is that current estimates are that 70% of the diagnosed population are under the age of 14. So we have a huge rate of children who are going to be growing into adulthood coming very, very soon, and we have services and systems that are underdeveloped and unprepared to deal with the current caseload they already have. And estimated lifetime costs for individuals on the spectrum, $1.4 to $2.3 million per individual, a huge public health concern for all of us. But what do we currently know about adults and outcomes for adults on the spectrum? Well, there are some wonderful research that's being done, and I hope to represent that here today and in a brief overview. And some of the trends that have emerged include the fact that the vast majority of individuals on the autism spectrum will meet criteria for the disorder for the entirety of their lifespan. And so this idea that we may be curing individuals or individuals may be falling off the spectrum, that's a minority of individuals. And so about 85 to 90% of individuals on the spectrum will retain that diagnosis, and that's an important point for us all to know. As well, some silver lining here is that actually most of the work does suggest that overall symptom severity tends to decrease with age. So if you look at our gold standard diagnostic tools like the ADI or the ADOS, we are seeing domain shifts and we are seeing improvement in core autism symptomatology into adulthood. And that's a very promising and fruitful avenue. We also have some evidence to suggest that the core areas of social communication tend to be a bit easier to change and tend to improve a bit quicker than those core areas of restricted and repetitive patterns of behaviors and interests. And just like in the childhood literature, and just like Dr. Kazri just presented on, IQ is the strongest predictor of outcome in most of these studies. We haven't gotten too nuanced about what is predicting outcome, but by and large, most of these studies are finding that IQ is a strong predictor of how adults do overall. Yeah, and language would I'm sure, play into this. Most of what has been looked at has been IQ-based. Just as we talked about earlier, there's future avenues that need to be explored. And there's also this growing concern about comorbidities in the adult population, psychiatric and medical comorbidities that really need to be given attention. And I'll tell you, at the CAN clinic, that is what we're doing a lot of treatment around, are these psychiatric comorbidities that also are present in adulthood. But the most shocking information I have today is just the absolute thin amount of research that is going into establishing evidence-based practices for adults on the with ASD who are adults. And the issue here is that we're not learning even from what we know about childhood, what's effective in childhood, and I'll present that. But what's even more startling is that these adults, they're aging and they're getting older, and these service supports are just not there to catch them. So let's think a little bit about these contextual factors that are related to development in adulthood. And I'm going to do this by thinking about the adult outcomes in kind of three areas. Autism symptomatology, so those core areas of concern. Behavior problems that may exist, so comorbid behavior problems, and then daily living skills, or the ability for that adult to live functionally in the world. And if you think about that adult, and then you think about all the contextual factors that are influencing that adult at any time, things like the family dynamics, socioeconomic status, work, health, schools, we have a very complex picture before us. And I've chosen to think about the work of Marcia Malik-Seltzer, and I don't know how many of you know of her work out of Madison, Wisconsin, but she has about a 14-year longitudinal study, pretty much the only of its kind that's actually followed adults through adulthood, looking at repeated measures of measurement from mothers, fathers, siblings, really rich data set of about 406 families. And I'm going to choose to kind of look at these outcomes on the backdrop of her really beautiful work here. So at time one of her sample, the mean age of adults were about 22 years of age. So they were at that really critical transition, high school transition point that I'm going to talk about in a few slides. And about 73% male, as you would imagine. 65% of these adults were living with their parents, and 95% had a diagnosis of autistic disorder in the DSM-4, right? So they were impacted with autism spectrum disorder, but probably a little more so. And what Marcia found was that she was able to replicate the trends I've been talking about from the previous slide. She did find that in 10 years of following these individuals, that by and large, they improved in their autism, core autism symptomatology, and they improved or remained stable in their reported behavior problems, which is really encouraging, which suggests that in adulthood, we're seeing this improvement in these areas over time. And in her work, the improvements really had to do with kind of two big factors that I wanted to highlight. One is IQ, so cognitive functioning mattered here for long-term outcomes. But another that I thought was quite beautiful is that parenting, that she was actually able to measure mother and child interactions, and their children were grown at this point, but she coded for maternal praise and warmth and respect, mutual respect in these dyads, and found that that was a factor that was related to the adult's overall functioning. So we find that the parent really and truly is an important aspect in this puzzle of adulthood, and that we need to think about, and I always think in terms of interventions and where to intervene and where to think of supports, and thinking of family supports, I think, is one huge area. Another area that we need to think about in terms of development for individuals on the spectrum into adulthood is the high school transition. And unfortunately, there's some sobering news here, and that is that even though overall, where's that little, here it is. That overall, we still see an improvement post-high school graduation. What's happening is that improvement is slowing. So if you can imagine, and this is irregardless of comorbid intellectual disability, you're still seeing the same trend. So even though, yes, technically they're still improving over time in their core symptomatology, that improvement is slowing. And that suggests that, these individuals are exiting out of this structured service that is the school system, and they're transitioning into what many have coined as the service cliff. They're dropping off into an abyss that is just not set up to properly support adults on the spectrum. And I think even more startling is we're seeing a very, very, very interesting effect of socioeconomic status. So again, irregardless of comorbid intellectual disability, what we're finding is that those from the lower income group are actually worsening post-graduation. So their trend is not that of continued gradual improvement. It's actually a trend of worsening symptomatology. And I think this is an area of grave concern and something that we need to continue to address. So if we think about school and that high school transition as a critical turning point for this adult, we should think about interventions that really deliver transition supports during that period of time. And I'll tell you that there aren't many that exist. There are some that are popping up that I'll talk about later on, but there really is a gap in that knowledge. And then the confound of socioeconomic status is great, and it's something that can't be ignored. Our lower resource families are struggling the most when it comes to transitioning these young adults into adulthood. So what every parent, I think, hopes for their child is once you transition from school, that you'll be able to seek some gainful employment. And that seems like a realistic goal for most young adults. And in the longitudinal sample I'm following today of Marcia Stelzer, what she found is that by and large, 75% of her population were either unemployed, underemployed, or at very restricted, sheltered, limited employment opportunities. And only a quarter were either seeking some sort of higher education or were in some sort of community-based employment, which is the current trend. And what's even more surprising is, see this 12% slice here, that no vocational educational activities group? Guess who represents the majority of those kids, of those adolescents and adults? It's actually adults without intellectual disability. So there is a real, true phenomenon of moving from the high school desk to the couch for a lot of individuals. And it might even be greater for individuals on the autism spectrum without intellectual disability, which suggests to me that maybe the current service landscape is actually better equipped to deal with intellectual disability, those with intellectual disability, and not autism-specific issues that may arise when you're looking and seeking employment. And this work has been replicated by Paul Shattuck and folks at Drexel University, and he's done a really nice 6-year follow-up of individuals post-graduation. And again, he found 2 years post-graduation, over half of these young adults had neither paid employment nor enrolled in any type of training or college. And that no participation rate was highest for our adults on the autism disability than any other disability group tracked. And 6 years post-graduation, it hadn't gotten much better. 1/3 had attended college, but only half had ever held a job. And we're not talking about completion rates here. So we don't have good evidence to know how many individuals who enroll in college actually complete. I imagine that that's a far fewer number, given what I know about the college landscape right now. And again, he was able to replicate this idea that family income matters. So you were more likely to be employed if you were from a family making $75,000 or more a year compared to those adults from poorer families, right? So again, we have this influence of SES that we see time and time again intersecting here with the ability to access services. And I'm sorry, this is, I know, getting a little depressing, but we're gonna move on to some more hopeful things as well. And I think one thing that contributes to some of the difficulties in employment has to do with the ability for adults on the spectrum to gain independence in their living skills and to gain the skills they need on the job. And another interesting, fascinating finding here is, and it goes along with this idea that maybe our current service landscape may be better able to support those with intellectual disability, is when you look at the adaptive functioning of individuals with Down syndrome, they continue to improve across middle age. So they're gaining skills, albeit slowly over time. That does not seem to be the case for our adults on the autism spectrum. In fact, they peak in their adaptive living skills at about 30 years of age, and then we see a decline in their adaptive functioning. And that's concerning. It means that we need to work on acquisition with these folks and maintenance throughout lifetime. And it may suggest that, as these skills are not being practiced, as these adults are being kept in the home, they're actually losing their skills that they've worked hard to gain. So work, of course, and employment and creating opportunities is another factor related to an individual on the spectrum, and it really is a place where I think we can do better and we can think about employment opportunities and interventions. And lastly, we need to think about the health of these individuals. Of course, these individuals are getting older, and what do we know about health outcomes? Well, from the longitudinal sample, and this has been replicated again and again, we know that psychiatric comorbidity is quite high. In her sample, it was at about 50%. Other estimates are even higher than that. And the usual culprits are here: anxiety disorders, depression, ADHD. Also seizures with its bimodal distribution. We know that seizure onset can happen in childhood, but it also can have an onset in adulthood, so it's something we also need to be aware of as practitioners. And the other really sad qualitative information from her work is that she estimated about 19 individuals had met a pretty untimely death based upon just basic things that were largely preventable, right? Choking, accidents, and illnesses that, had they been detected earlier, had that individual been able to communicate and advocate for their healthcare needs, they might have been prevented. And a recent study out of Kaiser Permanente in Northern California actually also suggests that this is a big issue. So they have a larger sample size, 1,500 medical records that they polled. And just to give a sampling, again, they found that by and large, adults on the autism spectrum have very high levels of psychiatric disorders compared to typical controls. And the other piece of this that I think is the important piece of this, that it also occurs in just medical conditions as well. So higher rates of sleep disorders, GI issues, hypertension, diabetes, and even more rare conditions such as strokes and Parkinson's disease. So we're seeing across the board that there's a vulnerability in this adult population, and it's not just around services for employment and vocation and education, but it's also around the physical health of these adults on the spectrum, and probably contributes to that large number that I mentioned, that 1.4 to 2.3 million that it takes to care over the lifetime for an individual on the autism spectrum. So we need to have considerations of the health of adults on the spectrum. So in summary of this section, what we've really been able to do is we've been able to see that, yes, we have a reduction in severity of autism symptoms and behavior over time. That's great, but we're also seeing that adults are at risk for declining daily living skills. And so that is concerning. And so even if you're getting better in your core autism symptomatology, if you can't function in society, and if you're riddled by psychiatric comorbidities and other things, it's going to make it virtually impossible for you to have a high quality life, which I think is the goal of all parents and all professionals working with this adult population. But there is some silver lining from this. Things like higher socioeconomic status seems to be protective. Positive parenting is a great sign that that parent really has an important influence in that adult's life, even across the lifespan. And obviously being in school and having that structured support for longer periods of time is really conducive for these adults to gain important skills. So moving on to interventions and supports now. I'm going to do kind of two things. I'm going to talk about kind of the current evidence for empirically supported treatments for adults on the spectrum. And then I'm going to move into highlighting some programs and some potential resources for you all that I think are nice, and they're available and they're out there in community. And it's just a sampling, I want to tell you. It's, again, think of that tip of the iceberg. We're just starting to develop these programs, and it is an exciting time to think about services for adults. But what is the current evidence for these practices? So there was a relatively recent review, and I come from childhood research, and so in childhood disorders, even though Dr. Kazari has mentioned that we still don't know enough. Believe me, we know a lot more about childhood behavioral interventions than we know about adulthood. So in this careful review, there were only 13 total studies identified that even attempted to look at empirically supported treatments for adults on the autism spectrum, and only 4 of those we would consider rigorous, using a randomized controlled trial design. 4 studies. And to me, that just blows me away. And interestingly, the majority of these studies have been on social cognition, things like social skills training. And the ABA world, that's so important in early childhood development, it's virtually unrepresented in the adult literature. It's a very unique phenomenon that's going on. So it's like we're not kind of learning, and I don't mean ABA in the sense of discrete trial training, right? That wouldn't be developmentally appropriate for an adult. I mean using good, solid behavioral modification techniques and behavioral principles and putting them in and testing them, putting them to the test in some of these adult programs. It doesn't exist anywhere, and so that's shocking. But the studies do range from specific social skills programs to some, I'll tell you the evidence for ABA, and it's really, really weak right now. It needs to be further studied, and kind of these general community-based employment opportunities. So in terms of psychosocial interventions for social cognition, that's where the majority of the focus has been for adults on the spectrum. And in fact, there is a UCLA-developed program, the PEERS program here at UCLA, that has gained national attention, and that is a really focused social skills intervention. And that has been put to the test with a randomized controlled trial for adults, led by Alex Gantman, a postdoc of Liz Lageson. And they did find improvements in self-reports and parent reports of social skills and responsiveness and frequency of get-togethers. So that's good. There's some emerging evidence that these targeted social skills groups may be effective. Of course, we need replication, right? And we need a lot of other people weighing in on this, but it's at least preliminary evidence that some of these programs may be effective for adults. We also have some social and vocational programs that seem to be making sense for empathy development or social cognition, but what's important is that it's not often translating to actual social functioning, and I think that is critical here. So even when we talk about generalization in young childhood, right, we want to teach them a skill and we want them to be able to use it in the real world. The same issue is happening here when we think about psychosocial interventions for adults. We can train them in one situation to respond better or to have more generative ideas. But when you kind of look at the overall social functioning of that adult in the real world, we're not doing a good job yet of figuring out what techniques really matter so that they can take those skills on the job or into relationships they may have in their life. In terms of that ABA I mentioned that has so much evidence in childhood right now, I could find 5 single case studies of ABA in adulthood. And that means that there's not any type of large-scale study effort going on. There might be one currently, but there's not one that's actually been published yet that looks at this in a rigorous way. Things like targeting the decrease of maladaptive behaviors and increasing positive behaviors, it just doesn't exist in the evidence base for adults right now. It doesn't mean that it's not anecdotally being done, because I know programs that are doing that. It's just that we need to prove that it works so that we can, get the federal backing and we can get the programs developed that are the most effective for adults. And the only way that our politicians are going to hear us is if we have the evidence to prove that these systems and these intervention techniques are important. One nod to community-based interventions, because it's the majority of what we see out there right now, these kind of grassroots community-based supported employment programs, leisure programs, they seem to actually increase the overall quality of life, and that's so important. But we also want to put them to the test to see what other types of meaningful outcomes, for adults perhaps can stem from these community-based approaches. So if you think about the service needs across the lifespan now, so I just spent some time reviewing the evidence, which is pretty thin. If you think about what is actually happening in real time out in community, you can imagine that there was a very recent survey that compared child to adult services, 3,500 individuals, and you can probably all tell me what the next bullet is going to say. But of course, adults are receiving far fewer services and have much greater unmet needs across the board in all the kind of major therapeutic intervention techniques you would think about: speech and language, one-on-one therapy, occupational therapy, all of it. These adults are sorely in need of individualized treatments that just don't exist in the community for them yet. And especially looking at those transition age youth, which I talked about as this like critical turning point for most adults. What do we know about that? Well, it's shocking, but 67% of families had no knowledge of any type of available transition programs for their young adult transitioning into adulthood. And 78% were unfamiliar with where to go if they wanted to work on vocational skills with their young adult, if they wanted to think about job development. And that just reflects a system that's not ready. And unfortunately, we need to get ready, because remember that 70% of the individuals on the spectrum are still children. So these children are going to age into adulthood. And unfortunately, I couldn't find an earlier report from the Department of Health and Human Services, but I can't imagine the situation has gotten much better. There is a really high staff turnover rate for programs supporting adults. 50%. That means 1 in 2 individuals that are working with adults in the community will leave after a year on the job. I cannot imagine what kind of havoc that causes to an already overburdened system. And the habitual vacancy rate for staff is 10 to 11%. And just to give you some context there, in any other industry, if you had a habitual vacancy rate of that, it would cease to function. It would be absolutely debilitating. And that's the day-to-day reality of our service structure right now for adults on the spectrum. And there's lots of reasons that are cited for this, things like low pay, poor benefits, high student-to-staff ratios, inadequate training. But these are things we can control. These are things that we can think about, right? How do we make it attractive to enter into the profession of working with these adults on the spectrum? Believe me, I see these adults every week in clinic, and they're amazing. And I think that if we can highlight their strengths and their tenacity and make the system a little more, enticing, we could actually start to attract high-quality professionals who I think could do a lot to ensure the future of this line of work. So I'm gonna switch a little bit to talk about some of these programs. Oh yes.
Do you know how the California Regional Center systems are working?
How the California Regional Centers are faring? Well, no system is faring very well, unfortunately, and so California is no exception to that. I'm going to talk a little bit later about there's some new energy and hope around the Affordable Care Act right now, and I know our local regional centers are looking at the self-determination initiation waivers as a possible new avenue that I think is an appropriate one. So stay tuned. We'll talk a little bit about that. Okay.
I have an adult, a 21-year-old, and part of the problem is he's had great intervention from UCLA. He worked with Connie's group when he was 3.
Oh, great.
Now he is reluctant to go to anything that's labeled or even associated with autism. So
Right.
what do you do with those people that had great interventions, they're totally aware of who they are, and they're scared to death, and they don't really fit into a program of people that have that?
Right. And so I think it comes down to, these adults need to be integrated more seamlessly into the natural fabric of the world here, and only given the types of services they need, right? So maybe it's not about, autism-specific services. So I know we're moving away from that in college settings where we're just thinking about it, promoting neurodiversity and thinking about individuals of all different flavors and how we can bring people together and just give specific supports without labels that just think about the behaviors, right? And the specific needs that these individuals have. That's one way to move away from these kind of autism interventions and move towards something that's more normative for a lot of these very high-functioning individuals on the spectrum. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time highlighting a local vocational skills training program, just because I think it's wonderful and I got a kick out of it. But there really is a movement right now towards independence in the workplace, and that's a great movement. It's away from these supported and sheltered community settings and into more supportive, inclusive environments for employment. But our individuals on the spectrum need to be prepared. They need to have the skills so they can hit the ground running in these settings. And one program that is doing this in the South Bay is called Transitions Consulting, and they have a program that they call the Evolve program. And this is a year-long course. I don't know if any of you are aware of this course, but it's intensive. It's almost 600 hours of direct teaching and instruction. And it's 6 months of kind of really intensive didactic training in the classroom. And then it's 6 months of an unpaid apprenticeship. And the thought here is that, in that unpaid apprenticeship, they can make inroads and hopefully be hired after the apprenticeship, because obviously the programs that they're partnering with are very amenable and inclusive and willing to work with adults on the spectrum. So I'm going to show you a couple of clips of this program in action. And the first is a didactic clip. And the co-directors, Robin Shipley and Sonia Dixon-Brax, are amazing with adults on the spectrum. And you'll see Robin leading a didactics group right now. And she's talking about character values of different people who are on the job. And she has some Confederate they're generating ideas around.
Respectful sharing. What's Brandon's deal? Yes. What do you want? Short man to make sure he doesn't have to talk to people. So we're thinking Brandon is he's not a social, friendly person. That's what we're getting, right? Yeah. What else do we think? This is Brandon. He's behind the scenes. He's behind, look at you, behind the scenes. Okay?
So she's drawing attention to how different people have different kind of underpinnings to them, right? Some people are behind the scenes people. They're not very social. Trying to think about that fit, right? Thinking about identifying yourself in the world of employment and how do you match your own propensities, what you want to do, what structure you need to the workplace. And then what's even more interesting, there's a large range of functioning here in this group, and you'll see Robin is really supporting kind of diverse learning styles in the room. So she's sitting next to two individuals, one who's on an AAC device and the other who's having a hard time with the auditory comprehension piece of the group. And so she's doing a lot of helping and writing out for him in the moment so they can also participate.
Not conscious of others, focus on self. Okay, guys. So, before we move on to our workers' courses,
So she's helping him access.
Vote whether we want to invite Brandon onto the team full time. This was his probation time. What is probation? Well, you're going to learn about this with Sonia. What?
Right? So she's there. So we're able to kind of push in services as they're needed in that group and really support the individual learning style of these individuals. And let me tell you, this has been wildly successful, and they have groups ongoing now. And I just use it to highlight there are many groups like this that are popping up. This is not the only one, but it's just one effort to think about what are the actual employment needs, the vocational needs of this population, and let's develop programs that are really meaningful that will support that future employment.
What's the cost of the program? And can parents use a 529 plan to cover it?
Right. I have no idea. I'm just going to say that quite plainly. But you know what? If you follow that website that I gave on the last slide, I'm sure they'll be able to answer your questions. They're lovely people. Yeah. So this spans, Connie, do you know the exact? I think it's 18 and beyond. I think that there's no upper limit. Might be 30. Okay. So, yes.
If you hold up your child's graduation from school, which you can do under the IDEA, it's not just about your curriculum units,
Right.
but it's being prepared for the secondary part of your life.
Right.
If you prevent the graduation, hold it up, and get good transition assessment, you could get a district to pay for some of these programs. So it's
Great.
very important. What are we coming up to graduation soon?
Yeah.
I do this for a living, that's why I know. But anyway, we hold it up.
Yeah.
And we say,
Till 22 years of age, right?
you can, but most of the kids that can get through high school and get the units, you can at least get another year of something like this. UCLA has its Pathways program.
Yep. Oh, it's on my next slide. You're reading my mind.
But I'm saying that these are not necessarily impossible to get funding for from a school district.
Great. Okay, good. Look, there's a wealth of information in this room here, so we should have a focus group right after. Yeah.
This program in Irvine, so
Right. This is only one.
with some major businesses in Orange County
That's great.
as part of the transitional.
Yeah, and I'm going to highlight one that's in Arizona that does something similar, right? There's some really great, innovative new programs on the horizon. So just to move on to just this acknowledgement, there also is higher education opportunities for adults on the spectrum. And from a recent report of Best Colleges Online, they actually did a nod to college programs for individuals with ASD. And so you can look that up online. But the top 3 are highlighted here for you. And these programs have really gone to great lengths to be inclusive for adults on the autism spectrum. They have specific services in place at these universities. They have pull-out programs. They have accommodations. They have social support groups. You name it. They've really done a really great job of thinking about how to make college accessible for individuals on the autism spectrum. And so that's an exciting new horizon, and it's an effort we actually are currently undertaking here at UCLA as well. But one program that does exist at UCLA is that UCLA Pathways program. Now that's through UCLA Extension, so it's not part of main campus, but it is a beautiful program for those with developmental disabilities to really get a taste of college life and really be a part of the higher education community, as well as a nod to some of these online community college courses and degrees that are popping up that are specific and are actually being marketed to individuals on the autism spectrum, with the acknowledgement that not everyone can drop and go move to Philadelphia to participate in some of these wonderful college programs, but still this desire to continue higher education. And in fact, there was some very good evidence from the longitudinal sample that I've been talking about throughout this study, that when Dr. Marcia Salick looked at young adults without intellectual disability, about 50% of them were attempting to go to college or were seeking some sort of higher education training. We don't know about completion rates. Of course, that's much lower than the about 70 to 75% of typical individuals still. So, oh, I see a hand. Yes.
I was just wondering, has there been any information on barriers as far as graduation? I mean, specifically, I'm thinking in some of our communities that have less resources, regardless of the intellectual abilities. You have students being put on an alternative track where they don't get a diploma, they get a certificate, and how that impacts the access to some of these programs.
It's gonna impact it greatly. I mean, you have to have graduated with a high school diploma to be able to access many of these programs. Although some of them have less stringent criteria, and so I'll leave that to you to look at the exact criteria for each of the programs. But it's a really real issue, right? That this is not created equal for every individual on the autism spectrum. It may be for a select few, but it's also an important important piece to highlight here when we think about adulthood. Yes, please. Hi, Ms. Plus, how are you? Good.
I had a parent that demanded that her son get a graduate from high school. They wanted to give him a certificate. She said no. He struggled through all of this, and he's going to go through the graduation process.
That's great.
She demanded it. So I let him know that you can request that.
Mhm.
That your child get a graduation certificate.
Great. And there's that parent advocacy piece coming in again, right? Parents are, of course, an important influence on even the adult's life and advocating for the needs of that adult. And I only have 2 more minutes. I'm being cut off. So I want to finish my talk. So please come to me afterwards with your questions. I just want to highlight one comprehensive program out of Arizona. And there are many. I think there's one in Irvine that was just talked about that's similar. But people are starting to step up their game when it comes to thinking about how we meet the needs of adults. And it's multi-pronged, and it's going to be different for all adults because they're all diverse in their learning style. But things like using ABA principles, how about that? In the home and helping parents support any challenging behaviors. Thinking about vocational assessments, right? Helping young adults think about that transition and plan for it, as well as these employment programs. And one that I kind of got a kick out of coming out of the SARC program is their Beans Cafe they have. And it's a whole program that's run by and for adults on the spectrum. And they're baristas in this coffee shop. They sell coffee, they make coffee. It's a wonderful program. It's in community. The community loves it, embraces it, and they're able to raise money for all of these causes that we know are so important. And lastly, the Affordable Care Act is on the horizon. It's a potential way for Medicare funding to flow directly to adults so that with autism and their families, so that you can determine what types of services your individual adults should get. I caution that if we don't have services available, that's still going to be a problem, even if you have the money to pay for it. So we have to do a better job. But it's currently in these pilot stages of feasibility with your local regional centers. And final thoughts, 50,000 individuals with ASD turn 18 every year in the United States, 50,000. And our programs are underdeveloped and underfunded to reach the needs. So we really need to understand what kinds of transition supports do we need in that critical period between high school and adulthood. And we need to develop autism-specific interventions. Not the interventions that are available right now are not sufficient based upon the data. We need more autism specificity. But the silver lining is that there's new energy into this area. It's on the federal government's radar. New money is coming into it, and there is a lot of hope. And lastly, CART is trying to do something about this as well in my 48 seconds. And they're doing a few things. One is happening at the CAN Clinic, which is a child and adult neurodevelopmental clinic led by Drs. Inji Lin and Mina Park in the audience. We're running young adult groups for comorbid anxiety and depression and vocational skills training groups. There's the UCLA Peers program here at UCLA. There's a joint venture that I mentioned earlier just in the early stages between CART, the Office of Students with Disabilities, and the CAPS program to look at better supports for college students at UCLA who are on the spectrum or are just struggling with diverse social needs. And then our newly funded AIR-B network is also focusing on some high school transition issues. So stay tuned for more to come from CART specifically, and I thank you for listening.